Hey guys, if you were born a lowly peasant in a time when yawning in front of a lord could earn you a punishment worse than stepping on the noble's dog, then you're in for a very long and very polite life. The year is somewhere around the mid-1300s. No one's too sure. Not even your parents, who don't know their own birthdays. You arrive at dawn, slippery and squalling, in a straw-strewn corner of a creaking, drafty cottage with soot on the ceiling and a chicken pecking the floor for crumbs. The midwife doesn't write anything down. She just looks at your open, gasping mouth and mutters, "He's got the devil's breath already." That's not a compliment. You weigh about as much as a sack of turnips and are wrapped in whatever scrap linen could be spared from your father's old undershirts. Your mother is already up again, attending the fire, because even giving birth isn't a reason to slack. She'll be expected to boil the laundry by afternoon. Your father doesn't hold you like in modern movies. He glances down once and nods, then spits on the floor and says, "Hope he learns to keep that mouth shut." Because where you've been born, into a hamlet on the edge of some baron's deer-filled forest, your mouth is both your greatest liability and your least welcome feature. Babies are expected to cry, but once you're past swaddling age, the unspoken rule kicks in. Only lords may yawn. Everyone else must grit their teeth and pretend they're endlessly fascinated by whatever dull directive is being handed down. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your first few days pass in a blur of squawks, burps, and being wrapped like a dumpling in a cloth soaked in lavender ash, meant to ward off plague. Not that it really works. 3 infants down the road die before their naming week. But you, for whatever reason, survive. Maybe it's your lungs. Maybe it's the fact that your family has a strange tradition of rubbing ox grease behind your ears before sleep. As a baby, you're kept mostly near the hearth, away from the cold wind that snakes through the wattle walls. And yet every adult who passes by seems to look at you suspiciously if you make too much noise. Mouthy. Watch that one. By the time you're walking, you've learned to be quiet. Not because you want to, but because the adults around you do this strange hissed shh noise anytime a noble's horse clumps into the village. You don't understand why, but you do understand that if you so much as laugh or squeal in view of a silk-sleeved rider, you might get yanked into a pig pen and held there until the danger passes. Your first real lesson about yawning comes one dusky afternoon when you're barely 3 years old. You're sitting in the dirt, poking a stick into a beetle hole, and a fat man in a feathered hat walks by on a white horse. Your mother grabs you by the collar so quickly that the beetle goes flying. She whispers, low and serious, "Don't look at his face. Don't show your teeth." You ask, "Why?" And you almost say it with your mouth wide open, the way all toddlers do, too curious for their own good. She doesn't answer, just shakes her head and mutters something about the stocks and what happened to old Leif. You don't meet Leif for another few years, but when you do, he's the local cautionary tale, an old man with no teeth and a permanent sideways smile, rumored to have been hit with a yawn rod for stretching his face during morning prayers while a visiting bishop was present. So you learn, slowly and painfully, that your mouth must not betray your thoughts. You practice pinching your lips together when you're tired. You try to cough instead of yawn. Sometimes you hum to yourself just to keep your jaw busy, but none of it feels natural. As you grow, your body stretches like old leather, all knees and elbows. Food is simple. Gruel in the morning, maybe boiled greens at night. And if someone dies a pig, the smell of meat haunts your dreams for weeks. You have no fork. You eat with your fingers. And if you drop something, it's not a waste, it's a sin. You sleep on hay that stinks of sheep. Your pillow is your arm. And if you wake in the night with a yawn threatening to escape, you bite the inside of your cheek. You never know who might be watching. Your parents aren't cruel, they're just exhausted. Your mother hums old songs in a language no one uses anymore. Your father teaches you to hoe straight lines in the garden and not to talk while you're working. The mouth's for chewing, he says, not for wandering. And yet, the stories that circle the fire at night are full of warnings. Warnings about people who didn't follow the rules. One tale tells of a boy who yawned during a feast and had his tongue nailed to a plank. Another tells of a baker who opened her mouth too wide while laughing and was forced to wear a chain bridle every Sunday for a year. You're not sure which stories are true, but you do know this. When a noble visits, every mouth in the village disappears. You see people tighten their lips like knots. Even the dogs seem to whimper more quietly. And yet, your body doesn't care about etiquette. When the sun is hot and the Lord's speech is long and droning, your jaw starts to tremble. Your tongue gets heavy. You feel that horrible pull behind your eyes, the warm rise of a yawn like bread swelling in an oven. You hold it in. You always hold it in. Because somewhere deep in your child mind, you already know. A yawn in the wrong direction could ruin your life. You're barely old enough to carry a bucket without spilling half of it when the concept of hierarchy starts to shape your every gesture. In your village, where the houses slump like old men and the paths are more mud than road, the idea of bowing isn't just for ceremony. It's survival. You're raised with the firm understanding that your body belongs not to you, but to the expectations of those who wear rings. You don't think of yourself as a child with opinions or expressions. You think of yourself as a walking performance, one that must remain tightly controlled at all times, especially when your audience wears velvet or brocade. So, you practice, not out of pride, but out of instinct. You bow when the elder walks by. You nod slightly when the reeve inspects the chickens. You even learn how to smile with your mouth closed, which feels wrong, but earns fewer glares. And most of all, you learn not to stretch your limbs too freely in public. A stray yawn, a lazy shrug, those are read as rebellion, or worse, disrespect. Your parents reinforce it gently at first. Don't slouch, chin down, hands still. But eventually, their corrections grow sharper. One day, after you scratch your ear while a noblewoman is passing through on her horse, your father cuffs you and mutters, "That's how boys end up in the stocks with turnips thrown at their heads." Turnips, you learn, are soft only on the inside. You're about 6 the first time you attend one of the manor's outdoor events. It's not a proper feast. You'd never be invited to that. This is more of a gathering, a performative display of power for the villagers. There's a long table under a faded canopy. The nobles sit and laugh and eat things you've only ever smelled, not tasted. Roasted meats, spiced wine, fruits that don't grow anywhere near your village. You're there to carry water and not spill any of it. Your job is to pour it into ceramic cups held out by sweating, bored knights who never look at your face. One of them yawns, widely, unashamed, and waves his hand in the air like he's swatting a fly. You're stunned. Not because he's tired, everyone's tired, but because no one reacts. No one reacts. He's allowed. He's allowed to be bored. You, however, are not. You must smile politely while carrying the water, your lips tight even when the weight of the jug makes your arms tremble and your jaw starts to ache from the forced expression. Later, you whisper about it to your cousin. You ask, "What if I yawned in front of a knight?" And she looks at you as if you just announced plans to drink the Lord's wine. She says, "You'd get whipped or locked in the root cellar, or they'd make you wear the fool's hat forever." She says this last part as if it's worse than death. Because where you live, Honor isn't measured by gold or birthright alone. It's also about control. You can't afford to appear loose-lipped, weary, or anything less than rigidly respectful. And yawning? Yawning is interpreted as the physical expression of disinterest, a bold insult, a declaration of boredom in the presence of someone who expects to be worshipped. You begin to notice how even the elders suppress their yawns. They sniffle, blink, mutter soft prayers, but they do not stretch their jaws. Not in church, not during the quarterly Lord's address, not even at funerals, where the monotone chanting stretches on like a millipede. One afternoon, while you're collecting thatch near the edge of the estate forest, you see a group of younger noble boys practicing falconry. One of them, not much older than you, yawns several times, extravagantly. His mouth opens so wide you can see the fillings in his back teeth. Nobody scolds him. In fact, the steward laughs and says something about the lad needing a nap. You crouch lower in the grass, watching. Your stomach knots. Because here's the rule, written nowhere but carved deep into the social marrow. The higher you stand, the more air you're allowed to waste. A lord can yawn as if he's preparing to swallow the sky, and no one will question it. But you? You open your mouth too wide, and you'll be accused of mocking the sun. At home, your mother begins to train your posture more deliberately. She places a spoon under your chin during meals, so you learn to lift food with dignity and not slump forward like a wild dog. You chew with your mouth closed, you swallow without noise, and you certainly do not sigh with tiredness. Once, at dusk, you see her yawn by the fire. Just for a second. Her mouth opens slightly, but then she immediately raises her hand, covers it delicately, and crosses herself. She notices you watching and gives you a warning look. "You must never let them see you do that," she whispers. "They'll think you're trying to show them your soul." That's something people believe, apparently, that yawning reveals your inner self to spirits. And the lords, who think of themselves as near godlike, are not keen on being reminded that the people under them have souls at all, let alone that they might display them. You start to experiment in private. In the forest, behind a tree, you let out a real yawn. It feels like your whole face stretches to the heavens, your eyes water. It's glorious, like shedding your skin. You do it again, and again. Then you return to the village and put your mouth back into its tiny cage. You're now old enough to attend the seasonal sermons in the manor chapel. The building smells like incense, wet stone, and candle drippings. The priest's voice drones on for hours about humility, obedience, and the dangers of wandering thoughts. You try to listen, but your body betrays you. You sway, your chin dips, your jaw quivers, and just before it happens, just before your mouth opens of its own accord, you pinch your thigh so hard it leaves a bruise. Better pain than disgrace. Because everyone knows, those who yawn openly do not respect the order of things, and those who don't respect the order of things must be corrected. So you learn to live with a closed mouth, a still tongue, a face as smooth and blank as the wall of the manor pantry. And when people say, "That one's quiet," you smile, internally, because you know it's the only way to stay safe in a world where your jaw could condemn you. You're 9 years old when it happens for the first time. Not the act itself. You've yawned before, in the safety of shadow, alone beneath hedgerows or under the cover of your family's thatched roof. No, this time it's public. This time your lips part in full view of a person who wears a ring on every finger and rides a horse taller than your cottage. It happens in the village chapel, on the feast of St. Cuthbert. The air is thick with frankincense and dust. You've been standing for nearly 2 hours, and the priest's monotone stretches every syllable into a woolen thread. You've counted the cracks in the altar stone, traced the stained glass saints with your eyes until your vision goes fuzzy. You're doing everything you can to stay alert, but your body is weak, your knees wobble, your stomach's empty. You haven't had breakfast because your mother said fasting helps your prayers travel faster. And then, like a creeping tide, it arrives. That warm, irresistible heaviness behind the eyes, the tingling in your jaw, the slow, wide pull of your mouth. Your lips open, your tongue presses down, a quiet, traitorous sigh escapes from your throat. It's a full-bodied, involuntary yawn, and it happens right as the priest glances your way. The silence that follows is not the holy kind. He stops mid-sentence. The congregation freezes. You don't even realize what you've done until your cousin pokes you with her elbow so sharply it knocks the breath from your ribs. The priest's gaze sharpens. His voice returns, now laced with something sour. "It appears," he says slowly, "that some among us find the word of God tiresome. You want to melt into the stone floor." He doesn't say your name, of course. That would be far too generous. But he does fix you with the kind of look usually reserved for moldy bread or unruly pigs. And the rest of the sermon? It's delivered in your direction. A slow, rolling tide of warnings about sloth, arrogance, the dangers of inattentiveness, all of it soaked in metaphor, but pointed like a spear. After the Mass, you're summoned, not by the priest, but by your father. He doesn't shout, he doesn't scold, he just puts a hand on your shoulder, squeezes, and mutters, "Well, now you've got their eye." And that's worse than punishment, because punishment, at least, is over and done. But being watched, that lingers. The story spreads, first through the children, then among the elders. You hear them talking in low tones near the well. "Did you see the boy? During the gospel? Mouth wide as a snake, disrespectful, like he'd rather be sleeping than listening to the priest." Which is true, of course, but it was never about preference. It was about instinct. Still, no one cares about instinct. By the week's end, your nickname is Yawning. Not to your face, but you hear it whispered behind hands. You try to laugh it off. You try not to cry, but mostly, you try not to yawn again.
And yet, the fear doesn't fade, because something's changed. You've been marked. There's a baker's apprentice, Tommy, who once sneezed during the Lord's reading of a decree. Not only did he have to apologize on his knees, but the steward made him wear a sack with the word "nose" painted on the front in tar. He wore it for a month. Even now, years later, people call him Snot. You dread becoming a similar cautionary tale. One evening, while fetching water from the stream, you ask your mother, "Why does everyone act like yawning is evil?" She thinks for a while, then says, "Because it shows you forgot your place." That doesn't make sense to you then. You don't understand how something your body does without your permission could reveal your social status. But later, much later, you'll realize what she meant. That in a world where every movement is measured, spontaneity is seen as rebellion. A yawn is a momentary lapse in self-control. And self-control is the only currency peasants have. So, you adapt. You become hyper-aware of your body's urges. You feel them before they even begin. You tense your jaw when the weather grows warm. You clench your fists when the air gets stale. You become a master of breathing through your nose and keeping your teeth together. Other children your age don't understand the discipline. They run, jump, roll in the dirt, but you move carefully, speak sparingly, and above all, never relax your face. You look like a child, yes, but your eyes carry the exhaustion of someone twice your age. And then, there's your first spring fair. A traveling troupe arrives. Musicians, jugglers, a man who claims to swallow swords, though it's clearly just a painted stick. Everyone gathers. Even the manor steward attends, lounging beneath a makeshift canopy with his boots propped up and a smug grin stretched across his ruddy face. The jester performs last. He's loud, absurd, exaggerated. He mimics noble speech, flutters his hands, and at one point, he yawns. Intentionally, grandly, with one hand behind his head and the other fanning his mouth. The crowd bursts into laughter. You freeze. Because that yawn isn't punished, it's rewarded. The steward chuckles. Coins are thrown. You realize something. Context is everything. The jester yawns because he's allowed to mock boredom. That's his job. That's what keeps him safe. You have no such shield. You return home that evening thinking thoughts far too old for your bones. The rules aren't consistent. They shift, bend, favor those with the right hats and titles. You're angry, in a slow-burning way that stays in your chest. But you're also determined. You will never let your face betray you again. Not during sermons, not during the steward's inspections, not during the dullest hours of the longest harvest days. You will keep your mouth shut, because in your world, a yawn is louder than a scream. You're barely into your 10th year when the world of rules begins to expand beyond what your parents can recite by the fire. That's when the traveling etiquette instructor comes through. Yes, they exist. And spends 2 muddy weeks in the manor, offering noble children and promising village stock a chance to learn proper comportment. Somehow, your name gets submitted. Maybe your father wants you to learn discipline. Maybe your mother thinks if you appear mannered enough, someone might take you into their service and you'll escape the mud forever. So, you go. And you sit on a splintery bench with a half-dozen other squirming children while a man in a faded blue doublet lectures you on how to hold your face. He's got an accent no one can quite place, and a walking stick he uses more for emphasis than balance. He taps it on the floor each time he says, "Stillness is strength." He doesn't just mean posture. He means everything. He means the angle of your wrists when you sit, the exact way to incline your head when acknowledging someone of higher rank, the number of seconds you are allowed to hold eye contact, 3 if they're above you, 5 if they're your equal, none at all if they're royalty, and most disturbingly, the approved expressions of sleepiness, hunger, discomfort, and enthusiasm. Yawning, of course, isn't on the list. Not even close. He brings out a little book. Well, not really a book, more like a sheaf of stitched parchment. And he reads from it like scripture. "On bodily lapses and the dangers of slackness," he announces. A title so thrilling, half the class immediately stops blinking. Yawning, he reads aloud, is a sign of indolence, contempt, or boredom. It should be resisted at all costs, as it offends the dignity of one's superiors and reflects poorly upon one's household. You notice he says should be resisted, not can, as if it's always a choice. You want to raise your hand, to ask, "But what if I'm tired?" But you know better. So you sit, and you learn. You memorize. He teaches a method for preventing yawns by lightly biting the inside of your cheek. He encourages you to press your tongue to the roof of your mouth and breathe shallowly through your nose. He demonstrates how to fake a sneeze to mask an approaching yawn. You find yourself practicing these things even outside of lessons. Soon, your body becomes a toolbox of suppression techniques. But even that isn't enough. Because eventually, the etiquette man brings up punishments. Not just consequences, actual, physical, strange, very real punishments used in different regions to discourage improper displays of fatigue. He speaks in the same tone a butcher might use to describe cuts of meat. In a certain northern duchy, he says, servants caught yawning during meal preparation must wear a heavy iron ring around their neck for a day. In one southern city, apprentices must kneel in salt for an hour,
mouths stuffed with wool if they yawn in front of the guildmaster. In another place, he won't say where, he claims an entire village once made a yawn-off offender walk backward around the town square holding a fish in each hand while singing a hymn through clenched teeth. Everyone laughs at that one, except you, because you believe it. And not just because it's bizarre, though it is, but because the more you learn, the more you understand that the punishments for yawning aren't really about the act. They're about the message.
Yawning in public says, I have needs you've ignored. It says, you do not captivate me. It says, I am tired and you do not care. And if you're a noble, those messages are dangerous. If you're a commoner, they're deadly. So, instead, you rehearse what the etiquette man calls composed stillness. You learn how to sit with your hands folded just so, your shoulders slightly back, but never rigid. You keep your chin down, but not tucked. You keep your eyes alert, but neutral. Your mouth closed, but not pinched. It's like balancing a teacup on your skull, except there's no teacup, and if you drop it, you lose your reputation instead of your drink. After 2 weeks, the etiquette man leaves. He takes his stick, his parchment, and a small sack of silver and disappears into the rainy horizon. But he leaves something behind, in your spine, a stiffness, a constant awareness. From then on, you notice every yawn around you, even the small ones, even when people try to hide them. You notice how the cobbler's apprentice, a sullen boy with dusty hair, covers his mouth too slowly one afternoon while the steward is making his rounds. The steward doesn't react immediately. He just makes a note in his ledger. The next week, the boy is passed over for delivery duty and has to spend his days boiling glue. You notice how the butcher's daughter clenches her teeth too tightly while yawning during an early morning greeting. Her mother swats her and says, "Do you want people to think you're ungrateful?" You notice how even the old men who sit by the forge all day, mumbling about taxes and pigs, never fully open their mouths unless they're laughing, and even then, only when no one important is near. Yawning has become an invisible vice. You begin to wonder, who made this rule? Was it a single king long ago who simply hated being reminded of other people's exhaustion? Or was it gradual, a centuries-long layering of habits and punishments and fears until even children feel guilty for needing air? One night, you ask your grandfather. He's not like your father. He still believes in speaking plainly, though his teeth are mostly gone and his voice rattles like dry leaves. He leans close to the hearth and says, "They don't like to be reminded you have a body." You blink. They want to think you're tools, objects, silent, unmoving. If you yawn, you remind them you're tired. If you're tired, it means they've worked you too long. And if they've worked you too long, then maybe they're not so noble after all. He coughs, a long, wet sound. But no one says that, he adds. So you learn to pretend. The fire pops.
By the time you reach your early teens, when your limbs stretch out of proportion and your voice cracks like old timber, the punishments stop being fairy tales whispered over soup and start becoming lists. Actual, physical lists, nailed to walls, hung in the chapel vestibule, read aloud by tired clerks before village meetings. They're not called punishment lists, of course. They have grander titles. Regulations of orderly conduct, provisions for moral rectitude, reminders for public decency. But everyone knows what they really are. Inventories of how your body might betray you and exactly what will happen when it does. And there it is, tucked near the middle of the scroll, just below inappropriate whistling and above ill-timed sneezing. Persons displaying discourtesy via unseemly jaw-stretching or audible yawns in the presence of authority shall be subject to correction by the designated parish steward. You stand before that wall for a long time, lips pursed, as if the words might slip off the parchment and into your throat. Unseemly jaw-stretching. That's the phrase they use. So formal, so bloodless, so absurdly specific. You imagine a monk somewhere, probably cloistered in a tower with no ventilation, choosing those words with utmost care, ink smudging at the corners of his sleeves. You feel like you stumbled into a theater, handed a script you never auditioned for. Still, you read on. Below the offense are options for correction: public apology, kneeling with arms extended, recitation of the 7 pledges of gratitude, wearing of the linen hood for a day and a half, and, if deemed repeat behavior, placement in the post for mockery. You already know what the post means. Every child does. It's a crude wooden pillar in the center of the square, fitted with an iron collar and a wide plank to support the arms. A punishment borrowed from older times, still stubbornly in use. Anyone caught in it must stand, still and silent, while townsfolk pass by with whatever fruits or insults they can spare. It's half discipline, half theater, and it works. No one wants to end up at the post, especially not for yawning. But what sticks with you isn't the severity of the punishments, it's the care with which they are written. Someone went out of their way to codify this. Someone, likely many someones, decided yawning required containment, formalized it, printed it on parchment, affixed it with red wax, and tied it with braided cord. That realization unnerves you more than anything, because now you know this isn't superstition anymore, it's law. So you study the list, you memorize it, every line, every word, because you can't risk being careless. You become hypervigilant. Your days begin with mental rehearsals. Don't slouch, don't stretch, don't speak unless spoken to. Don't open your mouth when it's not required. Don't breathe too heavily. Don't yawn. Don't yawn. Don't yawn. Your body starts to feel less like yours, more like a borrowed costume. One wrong movement and the illusion will tear at the seams. Others notice your stillness. One of the older boys in the village calls you the wax doll. But even he looks down when the steward passes. No one is truly brave, not when the rules are etched in ink and hung for all to see. Sometimes you wonder if the lords even notice, if they read the same lists, if they're aware of the consequences etched into your bones. But then, one day, you overhear a conversation. You're delivering firewood to the manor's side kitchen, as you do every other Tuesday. The door is slightly ajar, and inside, 2 visiting nobles are chuckling over honeyed cakes and hot cider. Their voices are airy and bored. One of them says, "Did you see the boy at chapel? Nearly fell over, stifling a yawn." The other laughs. "Poor thing, he looked like he might burst a vein." "I suppose it's our fault for being so dreadfully interesting." More laughter. You don't know what you expect in that moment. Maybe pity, maybe guilt. But you certainly don't expect mockery. You stand there, 1 foot in the doorway, holding a bundle of kindling like it's a shield, and feel something shrivel inside. Not anger, exactly. Something smaller, sadder. The quiet realization that those in charge aren't just indifferent to your suffering, they're entertained by it. You retreat. You don't finish your delivery. You go home and spend the rest of the evening staring at the wall. Later, your mother thinks you're ill. She makes you drink bitter tea and rubs your forehead with cool cloths. But it's not fever. It's disillusionment. Still, you keep playing the role, because you have no choice. The next time there's a public reading of the village conduct list, you mouth along with the steward. The villagers think you're well behaved. They think you've absorbed the lessons. And you have.
just not in the way they mean. You've learned that punishment isn't just about justice, it's about performance. It's about maintaining control, shaping behavior, and reinforcing power. And somewhere beneath all the rules and rituals and regulation scrolls, yawning has become a symbol. A small, quiet rebellion. A refusal to pretend. A reminder that no matter how much the body is trained, it still remembers it's human. But you tuck that thought away, deep inside. Because one slip and the list will find you. One misplaced breath and you'll be back in the square, face reddening under a linen hood, while someone shouts, "Look, he gaped like a goose in front of the Lord!" So you smile, you nod, you keep your mouth shut, and you wait. Because you've learned the most important rule of all. Survival is silence.
You never quite forget the day you saw a yawn treated not just as rudeness, but as a crime, an offense so grave it was answered with ceremony, with witnesses, with the somber tone of a courtroom that had no need for walls or formality, only for the presence of authority and the dread silence of a watching crowd. It was during a crisp, dry autumn when the leaves fell like quiet warnings, and the manor court was convened not for theft or debt or boundary disputes, but because a tanner's son, no older than you, had opened his mouth too wide in the presence of a minor noble during a grain tithe tallying. You hadn't been close enough to see the yawn itself, only the aftermath, when the boy was dragged by his collar into the center of the green where a makeshift bench had been placed for judgment, and the steward stood tall with his ledger, calling forth names and witnesses, as if this were a murder trial instead of a moment of tiredness on a long afternoon. The boy's name was Edric, and he was pale, confused, and trembling, not because he was guilty of some moral failing, but because he knew, as everyone knew, that justice here was not about fairness, but about preserving appearances, about reinforcing the layers of expectation that weighed down on all of you like wet wool. The noble in question, a forgettable man with pale eyebrows and a voice like damp bread, had apparently paused mid-sentence to glare at Edric, who had momentarily dared to shift his weight and release a breath with just enough slack in the jaw to be interpreted, or rather willfully misunderstood, as a sign of disrespect. That was all it took. A moment of fatigue, a slightly open mouth, and now the steward was reading aloud from a thick sheet of parchment, the ink still fresh, declaring that this act, uninvited mouth opening during a noble's enumeration of village assets, constituted a breach of decorum, a visible slander of dignity, and a symbolic erosion of feudal order. You stood near the back, the crowd pressing close, and even the chickens fell silent as Edric was sentenced, not to stocks or flogging, but to something far more public and theatrical, the circle of submission, a punishment so rarely used it had become legend. They made him kneel in the center of a rope-drawn circle for 7 hours, his back straight, arms outstretched, and a small wooden bit placed between his teeth, not to hurt him, but to keep his jaw locked, to make the point literal, to render the offense visibly corrected. He wasn't gagged or whipped, merely displayed, his own face the punishment, a message to everyone watching. This is what happens when you let your body speak out of turn. The bit was painted red, and someone had written the word sloth on a board above his head, though everyone knew that Edric was not lazy, just unlucky, just human, just another boy who made the mistake of being noticed.
You stayed and watched for far longer than you intended, not because you were curious, but because you needed to see how long he would last, how long it would take before he shook or collapsed or cried. But Edric did none of those things. He held his position, his eyes dull and glazed, and when they finally released him just after dusk, he didn't run or speak or even blink. He simply stood, removed the bit with both hands, and walked away with the gait of someone who had just left part of himself behind in the dirt. No one clapped. No one cheered. Even the steward looked vaguely uncomfortable, as though the spectacle had not been quite as satisfying as he'd hoped, as though the absence of resistance had robbed him of something. That night, as you lay stiff on your straw mat, the image of Edric's slack face haunted you more than any tale of ghosts or demons. You realized that what frightened you most wasn't the punishment itself, it was how little it had taken to earn it, how small the offense, how easy it was to fall afoul of the unwritten expectations that governed every gesture, every breath, every blink. You began to see the whole village through new eyes, through the lens of controlled faces and stifled impulses, where laughter was carefully measured and even sorrow was shown in acceptable increments. You thought back to the traveling etiquette man with his ridiculous parchment and thought, not for the first time, that he had been a symptom, not the disease. The disease was deeper, older, more infectious than anything a single man could carry. It was in the very soil, in the way mothers taught their children to walk without looking too confident, to speak without sounding too clever, to nod without making noise. From that day on, your own efforts at restraint redoubled. You no longer waited for the feeling of a yawn to come before suppressing it. You learned to anticipate it, to predict it, to cut it off in the prelude, like stopping a hiccup before it starts. You trained yourself to breathe in small, shallow bursts when tired. You practiced holding your jaw firm even while asleep, until you sometimes woke with your teeth clenched so tightly it felt like your skull might crack. You became known not just as a quiet boy, but as one who never seemed to tire, never stretched or slouched or sagged, a model of composure who kept his head down and his mouth closed. You were praised occasionally by teachers and elders who mistook your stillness for discipline, who thought your silence meant obedience instead of self-preservation. But none of them knew that beneath the surface, your mind was always working, always calculating angles, watching for eyes that watched you, scanning for signs that you might have accidentally given yourself away. You never spoke to Edric after that day. He grew older, slower, more withdrawn. He stopped coming to gatherings, took a job outside the village wall, and eventually disappeared altogether. Some said he joined a distant monastery. Others said he wandered into the forest and never returned. You believed neither. You simply imagined him walking forever with his mouth shut, a silent warning, a living echo of the list on the chapel wall. And still, you carried that moment with you like a stone in your shoe, pressing ever so slightly with each step, reminding you that in a world built on order, even the gentlest breath can be judged as noise.
By the time you were old enough to carry a load of firewood without your arms shaking and to wake up before the rooster without complaint, your fear of punishment had evolved from something reactive into something preventative, a quiet voice in the back of your mind that warned you not just against slipping up, but against ever letting your body forget that it was being watched. And it was around this time, when your back was stronger but your knees still knobby, that you first saw the contraptions, the tools of facial control made iron and wood, relics that were half myth, half memory, and entirely terrifying. It happened in the steward's shed, a place you weren't supposed to be, but the door was ajar and curiosity had a way of seeping into you whenever your chores were done early. So you stepped inside, nose wrinkling at the smell of old leather, cold metal, and something else you couldn't place, like the sweat of a frightened man long gone. Hanging from one of the beams, lit by a shaft of afternoon sunlight, was what looked like a mask, but not a festive one, not the kind worn at the rare midsummer dances when even the reapers were allowed to smile for an evening. No, this was something crueler, heavier, forged from rough iron with holes for eyes and a terrible curve of metal where the mouth should be, a grotesque parody of a human face, designed not to conceal expression, but to freeze it in place. You stared at it for a long time, unable to move, heart thudding in your chest not because someone might catch you, but because someone might make you wear it. And it was then that you remembered the whispers about the gossip's bridle, about the tongue cage, about the iron loop that fastened behind the head and clamped against the jaw, preventing speech, preventing sound, preventing even the twitch of a smile. These weren't stories after all. They were real, and they were ready, polished, stored, waiting for the next defense. The steward's voice startled you before you saw him, a slow, bored drawl from just outside the door, asking what you thought you were doing. And you turned quickly, stammering something about lost tools, but he didn't seem angry, just amused. He said, "That there's for those who forget their place. Good thing you don't seem the type." And then he winked, a gesture so casual, so jarringly light-hearted, that it chilled you more than if he had shouted. After that, you started seeing them more often, not the objects themselves, but the idea of them, the possibility that any room, any barn, any shadowed hallway might contain the instruments of silence. You noticed how the older girls in the village never laughed too loudly anymore, how the men paused before finishing a sentence if a noble was within earshot, how everyone seemed to carry an invisible brace around their face as if their jaws were preemptively locked in place. You learned the names of the devices, the brank, the scold's bridle, the shame mask, and you learned that they were not just for women, despite what the older boys liked to say when mocking their sisters. No, a yawn could earn it just as quickly as a rumor, and though the mask was more commonly used for those who spoke ill of the church or nobility, it was not beyond possibility that it be used for someone whose offense was purely visual, a face opened too wide at the wrong moment.
There was a boy, 2 villages over, who wore one, you were told, though no one knew why. Some said he laughed during a funeral. Others said he snored during evening prayer. Whatever the truth, he walked through the market once with the thing strapped to his head, the mouthpiece thick with rust, and people averted their eyes not out of pity, but out of recognition, because everyone knew it could just as easily have been them. You began to dream about the bridle. In your sleep, you'd find yourself trapped in it, unable to speak, trying to explain yourself, only to realize that no one was listening anyway because your mouth wasn't the problem, it was your presence, your being, your failure to become invisible enough. So, you made yourself invisible. You shrank your yawn into nothing. You taught your muscles to resist the pull. When you were exhausted, you hummed softly instead of sighing. When your jaw ached, you clenched a pebble between your molars just to keep your face from falling slack. You became a model of composure, and you began to feel proud of your control, even though it came from fear. That fear shaped you, it carved you, and yet a strange thing happened. The control, once rooted in dread, began to feel like power. You realized that in a world where most people couldn't stop themselves, where boys scratched and slouched and groaned and flailed, you could remain still. You could be perfect. Of course, the perfection was a lie. You still grew tired. You still imagined yawning in private, great glorious mouth-stretching yawns that shook the rafters, yawns with sound and breath and soul. You just never allowed them to exist in daylight. You became so good at hiding your fatigue that others began to trust you more, seek you out, assume you were reliable simply because you didn't slouch or stretch or speak out of turn. You were given errands. You were brought into rooms where you were expected to say nothing and watch everything. And there, in those rooms, you saw what the others never did. The Lord's yawning. Not once, not twice, often. The steward himself, standing before the ledger, hand on his belly, yawning like a lion mid-roar. The bailiff bored during a grain audit, stretching his jaw so wide you could count his molars. The visiting magistrate, barely awake at dawn, mouth gaping like a fish every other minute during the mayor's welcome speech. And no one stopped them, no one punished them. In fact, their yawns became signals. You are tired, therefore we will pause, bring wine, adjust the schedule, speak more softly. Their fatigue commanded care. Your fatigue commanded punishment. That's when it struck you, deep in your ribs like a cough you weren't allowed to make, that the rules weren't really about order or discipline or respect.
They were about reminding you that your body didn't belong to you, that your yawns were not just inappropriate, they were offensive, not because they meant anything, but because they existed in a body that society deemed too low to show need. And so, your silence became less about safety and more about survival, less about obedience and more about quiet resistance. You did not yawn, not because you didn't need to, but because you refused to give them the satisfaction of watching you punished for it. You imagined the mask again. You imagined it rusting. You imagined it waiting. And then you imagined it forgotten, left to hang in an empty shed, long after you had learned to control yourself so well that no one ever needed to fetch it again.
It was during one of those long, windless summer weeks when the very air seemed to sag with heat and flies moved slower than usual that a servant in the manor household, an older boy named Noel, who had once helped you carry sacks of barley during harvest, was made into an example. Not for theft or drunkenness or failing to curtsy fast enough, but for something much quieter, something everyone saw but no one acknowledged until it was too late. He yawned. It happened in the stables, or so the story went, while a minor noble's daughter was having her saddle adjusted for an afternoon ride, a pale, fidgety girl whose fondness for velvet gloves seemed far greater than her interest in horses, and Noel, who had been up before dawn tending hooves and hauling hay, allowed himself, just for a second, to drop his head and let his mouth part in the way a tired body sometimes does when it forgets where it is. No sound, no insult, not even a full stretch of the jaw, just the soft downward pull of exhaustion carving itself briefly across his face. But it was enough. She saw it. She frowned. She said something clipped and cold to the steward, and the steward, ever eager to impress, moved swiftly to assert that even such minor breaches of comportment could not be ignored in a household of dignity and rank. So Noel was summoned, not to the square or the stocks, but to the manor yard, where servants and field hands were called to gather, forming a half-circle of sweat-drenched bodies as the steward announced in his usual dry, nasal tone that while no physical harm would come to the boy, a lesson must be offered for the good of the house. What followed wasn't punishment in the traditional sense. It was theater, performance, a small morality play staged on crushed gravel and dirt. Noel was ordered to stand with a chalked sign hung from his neck that read, "I grow bored of my betters," and to walk in slow circles around the yard for a full hour, head high, arms loose, mouth clamped shut. The steward explained that this was to remind everyone that appearing weary in the presence of rank was not just impolite, it was offensive, a symptom of pride, and pride in a servant was the most dangerous contagion of all. Noel didn't speak. He didn't protest. He simply walked, dust rising in little clouds around his feet, the sign bouncing lightly against his chest as he circled once, twice, again and again and again, his expression unreadable, as if he had left his real face somewhere else, tucked safely away until the moment had passed. And you watched, from the back of the crowd, your hands balled tightly into fists behind your back, because there was nothing in what he did that merited correction. No disrespect, no rebellion, just a quiet moment of humanness mistaken for arrogance.
But the lesson wasn't really for Noel. It was for all of you. It was for every child who had ever blinked too slowly during a sermon, every girl who had stretched her arms a moment too long while baking bread, every field hand who had paused in the middle of labor to roll their neck and sigh. The steward didn't need to shout. He didn't need to punish with chains. The message was already clear in the faces of those watching. We must never appear tired, even when we are. We must never appear bored, even when we are. We must never appear anything other than completely devoted, or we risk becoming a cautionary tale in someone else's retelling. After that day, something shifted in the way you moved. You had already been careful, your posture trained, your jaw tight, but now you felt the watching in your bones. It wasn't just the steward or the priests or the nobility. It was the other villagers too. Everyone had become a mirror, reflecting expectations back at one another. a collective vigilance that reinforced the rules even when no enforcer was present. You caught yourself scanning faces in crowds, noting every twitch, every blink, every slow breath, wondering who might slip and who might be next. It made you feel older, not wiser, as though you had lost something soft and natural that could never be retrieved. You began to think of yawning not as an action, but as a memory, a thing that had once belonged to you and now had to be recalled like a distant childhood game. Even your dreams began to change. You no longer dreamed of flying or of chasing goats through the tall grass. Instead, your sleep became filled with visions of open mouths sealed shut, of invisible hands pressing down on your chin, of rooms where everyone wore the same blank face and spoke in perfect soundless unison. You'd wake in the middle of the night with your teeth clenched, jaw aching, pillow damp with sweat, and sit upright, heart pounding, even though no one was watching then. Still, the feeling lingered, that someone might come through the door and ask why you had breathed too loudly in your sleep. One afternoon, as you sat outside the bakery waiting for your mother, you saw Noel again. He passed by with a sack of flour over his shoulder, nodding politely to the baker's wife. No sign remained of his humiliation, no sign, that is, except the slight downward tilt of his eyes, the way he looked at the ground as though the air itself could accuse him. He didn't see you, or if he did, he gave no indication. He just walked, quiet and forgettable, like a stone that had finally learned not to draw attention to its edges. And you, who had once envied his strength and ease, now felt a strange mix of pity and recognition. He had been broken gently, publicly, without violence, but broken nonetheless. Not in the body, but in the will.
Later that week, a girl in your age group made a mistake at the altar. Nothing serious, just a moment of absent-mindedness when she fumbled the hymn book and muttered something under her breath that sounded like a groan. The priest didn't correct her. The priest didn't need to. The villagers did it for him. She was left off the embroidery list. The baker's son stopped offering her extra scraps. Even her own father seemed to walk a step farther from her in the fields. The punishment, you realized, was rarely declared. It was enacted, through silence, through exclusion, through the slow erosion of presence. You began to wonder whether any expression at all was truly safe. Was smiling too wide suspicious? Was frowning too much a form of complaint? What about blinking too slowly, coughing too loudly, scratching your nose at the wrong time? The rules were never written down all at once, only hinted at through reaction and repetition, refined each time someone stepped half an inch out of line and felt the consequences land like a feather that bruised anyway. So you taught yourself subtler tricks. You kept your hands folded not just in church, but everywhere. You blinked evenly, breathed through your nose, swallowed gently. You made your face into a mask, not out of fear, but out of practice. You began to forget what your own unguarded expression looked like. Sometimes, when you passed by a still puddle or a window pane, you'd catch your reflection and not recognize yourself. Not because your features had changed, but because the tension in your face had become so constant it no longer registered as effort. It was simply who you were now, a boy who never yawns, not because he isn't tired, but because the world has taught him that to appear tired is to seem ungrateful, and to seem ungrateful is the beginning of exile.
By now, your life has settled into a rhythm of invisible resistance, a pattern of quiet containment where the days blur together beneath the weight of control, and each sunrise feels like another test in a long, slow march toward an undefined safety that never quite arrives. And in this blur of restraint, you begin to pick up strange habits, old superstitions passed down by those who have lived with this pressure longer than you have, tricks to keep the body calm, to soothe the face, to distract the yawning instinct before it can rise to the surface and betray you. One of the oldest shepherds, a wiry man named Hal, teaches you the parsley trick, a bit of folk wisdom so peculiar and oddly precise that it can only have come from desperation. Chew parsley, he says one morning as the mist curls around the pasture like smoke. Raw, bitter, fresh if you can find it. Stops a yawn before it thinks to arrive. You don't believe him at first, but he insists,
And eventually, one late afternoon, as the sun burns low and the steward is expected for an inspection, you nip a few sprigs from the edge of the herb plot and chew them slowly. The taste sharp and grassy and slightly metallic. And to your surprise, the heaviness behind your eyes lifts, just a little, as though the bitterness is enough to convince your body that rest is unnecessary. Word of your success spreads. Soon others are trying it. Parsley tucked behind ears, crushed and smeared under nostrils, even stitched into the cuffs of sleeves so that a quick pinch and sniff might do the trick without notice. It becomes a quiet code among the village youth, a shared glance, a flash of green, a slow nod that says, "I see you, and I'm tired too, but we will not yawn today." It's not the only trick. Others speak of pinching the webbing between your fingers, biting the inside of your cheek, or humming softly through your nose while exhaling. The methods differ, but the goal is always the same: to keep your face quiet, your body unreadable, your instincts shackled in a way that looks like grace. You start carrying a small pouch of crushed herbs, parsley, mint, and occasionally rue, tied to your belt, tucked out of sight. It smells like a garden during rain, and you breathe it in before each gathering, each meeting, each sermon. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but the ritual itself feels powerful, like an incantation against the slow, creeping fog of exhaustion that the world pretends doesn't exist. Others develop their own talismans. One boy wears a tightly braided string around his wrist and pulls it 3 times whenever his jaw begins to twitch. A girl keeps a pebble beneath her tongue to remind herself not to open her mouth too wide. Some wear tight shoes to stay alert through discomfort. It becomes clear that everyone, in their own way, is inventing strategies to survive the quiet war against their own bodies. But the parsley trick remains the most popular. It's simple, accessible, and symbolic. And in time, it becomes more than just a remedy. It becomes a quiet rebellion, a way of saying, "I know what they expect, but I'll beat them at their own game." You begin to imagine a world where the parsley isn't needed anymore, where yawning is allowed, even expected, where being tired is not a sin, but a sign of labor, of effort, of existence. But such imaginings are dangerous, so you keep them to yourself.
One day, while working in the manor garden, you're approached by an older woman in servant's dress who's been in the household longer than you've been alive. She kneels beside you and whispers, "I used to yawn all the time, back when I was new. They told me to chew fennel, but I liked parsley better." You look at her, startled, and she smiles, just faintly, lips barely parting, eyes still on the weeds. "It doesn't work forever," she says, her voice barely above the breeze, "but it works long enough. And sometimes that's all you need." That night, you lie in bed and think about how many generations have passed this knowledge down, how many people before you have learned to choose silence into their mouths, to press herbs against their tongues like prayers. It makes you feel connected and terribly sad all at once, as if you've inherited a burden too old to carry but too sacred to discard. You wonder what would happen if you stopped, if just once you let the yawn come, fully and freely in front of everyone. Would the earth tremble? Would the lords vanish in a puff of smoke? Would the skies split open and pour down punishment? Or would nothing at all happen? Just a moment of breath, of release, of defiance disguised as a bodily reflex. But you know better than to try. You remember Noel. You remember Edric. You remember the mask in the shed and the list on the chapel wall. So you keep chewing your herbs. You keep your jaw tight. You teach younger children how to press their tongue to the roof of their mouth and look awake even when their bones ache. You become a guide, not because you seek authority, but because no one else will say aloud what everyone already knows, that the rules are heavier than the punishments, and that pretending not to be tired is the hardest job of all. And yet, in these whispered exchanges about parsley and posture, a kind of fellowship forms, not loud, not open, but strong. It is not written down, and it does not challenge the lords directly, but it is real. A resistance born not of banners or protests, but of shared suffering and secret knowledge. You begin to see it everywhere, in the way a girl adjusts her apron to hide the herb in her pocket,
in the way a boy stands near the back of a gathering so he can turn away if his mouth begins to tremble, in the way an old man coughs softly just as his jaw twitches, masking the yawn with practiced ease. These are not acts of revolution. They are acts of endurance, and they matter. You wonder if one day someone will write them down. Not the rules, but the remedies. Not the punishments, but the protections. A little book titled, How to Survive a World That Punishes Tiredness. You imagine it bound in cloth, pages filled with drawings of herbs, diagrams of pressure points, small poems about breath and silence and strength. Maybe it already exists. Maybe it's written not in ink, but in memory, passed from mouth to mouth, not in speech, but in chewing. In the bitterness of parsley leaves and the softness of breath held just behind closed lips.
It happens in the middle of a sermon, not a particularly long one, not even one delivered by the usual priest, but rather a visiting friar with a sun-browned face and a voice like gravel soaked in rain. And you, having prepared yourself as always with a sprig of parsley tucked between cheek and gum, and your hands folded neatly in your lap, feel relatively confident that you will weather the hour without incident. But then, somewhere around the part where he begins to speak of temptation and sin, of slothfulness and the devil's many disguises, he pauses, steps forward from the pulpit, lowers his voice, and says with a theatrical gravity that fills the chapel like smoke, "You know, my brothers and sisters, it is said in certain places that the devil enters not only through deeds, but through mouths left open in idleness." And just like that, the air changes. People shift in their seats, the children stiffen. Even the steward glances up from his customary place near the front, his interest momentarily piqued. The friar continues, slowly now, each word wrapped in menace. "It is through yawning that the devil may slip past your lips and nest in your throat, curl into your lungs, make a home beneath your tongue. Yawning, my dear flock, is not merely tiredness, it is invitation." You feel your stomach tighten, not because you believe it, not fully, but because you recognize the power of what's just been said, the way it merges superstition with control, fear with etiquette, turning a reflex into a ritual of suspicion. The adults nod solemnly. Some make the sign of the cross. One old woman near the door actually covers her mouth as if staving off an invisible breath. You do not move, but you can feel the parsley softening against your molars, releasing its bitter perfume into the roof of your mouth like a last defense. The friar then launches into a story, whether true or invented you cannot tell, about a monk who yawned during midnight prayer and spent the next week convulsing with fever, unable to speak, his body seized by unseen forces, until the abbot, in desperation, drove a nail into the chapel floor and commanded the devil to leave. You want to laugh, you want to scoff, but no one else does. The room is silent, spellbound, made pliable by years of rules and rituals that make such tales seem not only plausible, but probable. You glance around and see the expressions of those around you, wide-eyed children, their mouths firmly closed, older women clutching prayer beads with fingers white from tension, men with brows furrowed, not in skepticism, but in worry, already calculating how best to warn their families against the dangers of inattentive jaws.
Later, as the congregation files out into the dusty yard, the talk is of demons, of holy herbs, of preventative measures. Someone says sage is better than parsley. Another insists on angelica root, boiled and steeped into a thin tea. The village healer, overhearing, offers her opinion that rosemary, tucked into the sleeve, will do well to guard against both yawns and dark spirits. You say nothing, but you listen carefully, because while you no longer fear devils slipping in through your breath, you do fear what people will do when they believe such things. You've learned that the greater the fear, the stricter the control, and when a yawn becomes a gateway to hell, the punishments can only escalate. That evening, your mother adds an extra handful of herbs to the stew. "It's good for the soul," she says.
though she looks at you a moment too long when she says it, as though trying to tell you something without words. Your father, more practical, mutters that the friar has scared the village half to death, and that tomorrow the baker will probably charge double for anything with cloves. Your younger sister asks, eyes wide, whether it's true about the devil in your mouth, and you tell her gently that it's just a story, that God knows when people are tired and wouldn't punish them for breathing. But even as you say it, you hear your own voice and realize that it sounds rehearsed, like a line from a play you've recited too often to believe. That night you dream of mouths, not yours, but rows of them, empty and echoing, suspended in the air like lanterns, each one gaping silently as something dark and formless slips from lip to lip. You wake with a gasp, teeth clenched, and bite your tongue before the yawn can finish rising. It becomes a game then, or perhaps a curse, that you begin to see yawns in everything: the open windows of cottages, the mouths of wells, the gaps between fence posts. The world becomes one long invitation to let go, to open, to be vulnerable. And you, trained to resist, begin to feel the weight of that resistance in every bone. Soon, the parish children begin to play a new game: catch the devil's breath. They gather in corners, one of them pretending to yawn, the others gasping and covering their mouths, shouting that the devil has escaped and must be chased, captured, banished. It is foolishness, harmless on the surface, but you know better. You see how the game conditions them, teaches them to associate yawning with guilt, play with punishment. You wonder if this is how it always begins, not with laws or whips, but with fables and mimicry, with the giggles of children absorbing fear disguised as fun. Even the dogs seem quieter now, as though reluctant to pant too openly near the chapel. The chickens flap their wings more restlessly during sermons, perhaps sensing the tension that now hums just beneath the surface of every gathering. A sneeze during prayer now earns a dozen sharp glances. A cough might be taken as a sign of inner corruption. The body, it seems, is no longer just a vessel of work. It is a potential traitor, and its smallest outbursts must be managed, chastised, sanctified.
You begin to keep a new sprig of parsley tucked behind your ear at all times, partly for show, partly for comfort. It becomes your companion, your anchor, your shield. You see others doing the same. In the bakery line, at the mill, by the well, you catch flashes of green where there used to be none. It is not spoken of directly, but it is understood. This is our armor, our protection, not just against sleepiness, but against scrutiny. The herb becomes a badge, a shared symbol of those who know what cannot be said. And through it all, you feel the growing burden of control pressing harder, heavier, a pressure not unlike gravity, except it pulls not down, but inward, collapsing your natural self into something sculpted, rehearsed, reduced. You are not allowed to be tired. You are not allowed to breathe too deeply. You are not allowed to be human in front of those who demand divinity in the form of obedience. And yet, you survive. Every day you go out into the world, mouth closed, face calm, hands steady, and return home unscathed. Not because you are untouched, but because you have become so adept at hiding the touch that no one sees it anymore, not even you.
There comes a time, inevitable and strange, when your body begins to betray you in new ways, not with yawns exactly, but with the slow, creeping weight of age. Not old age, not yet, but the kind of maturity that brings with it a shift in labor, in responsibility, in posture, and most notably, in proximity to power. You are no longer just another boy in the back row of the chapel, or a nameless figure on the edge of the harvest line. You are now something slightly more visible, slightly more useful, and therefore slightly more watched. It happens the way a plant leans toward light without meaning to. One day, the steward asks if you can write. You nod, unsure whether to lie or tell the truth, but before you can answer fully, he says, "Good. We need a scribe, a quiet one." And just like that, your world changes. You become the one who copies names, who tallies lists, who records declarations and inventories and all manner of noble utterances, sitting cross-legged on a bench in the manor's west room, quill in hand, ink thick and sticky, the parchment laid before you like a field ready to be plowed. At first you were flattered. It feels like recognition, like reward for all your discipline, your stillness, your ability to disappear when needed. You're given clean hands, access to soap, the occasional piece of meat, and most precious of all, permission to sit in the presence of authority without being forced to serve it directly. But the privilege comes at a cost, subtle and steep. You are expected to be invisible and omnipresent, present enough to write every word, invisible enough to never react. You must not cough, you must not sneeze, you must not flinch or squirm or scratch or sigh or, God forbid, yawn. This is harder than you anticipated. The manor is not a place of drama. Most of what you record is dull beyond description. Crop assessments, sheep counts, updates on fence repairs, petty land disputes between neighbors who argue about boundary stones that haven't moved in 50 years. The noblemen drone. The ladies pause often to consider the elegance of their phrasing. The steward sometimes repeats himself 3 or 4 times, dictating in circles as if searching for the most pompous possible arrangement of words. And through it all, you must remain upright, attentive, perfectly composed, your hand moving even when your mind starts to wander. Because wandering minds lead to wandering faces, and wandering faces lead to open mouths. At first you manage, you chew parsley, you sit on a hard stool with a slight backward lean to keep your back engaged, you flex your toes inside your boots to maintain alertness. But the hours are long, the heat in the room stifling, the drone of voices as rhythmic and soothing as any lullaby, and eventually one day it happens. Your eyelids droop, your spine softens, your jaw begins to part, and just before the first true breath of the yawn escapes, you catch it, snap your mouth shut so fast your teeth clack, and the steward turns, eyebrow raised. "Did you speak?" he asks. You shake your head, eyes wide, pen still poised mid-word. He says, and nothing more. But the room has changed. The moment hangs there, invisible and pulsing, like a fly trapped beneath a bell jar.
You do not yawn again. Not in that room, not ever. Instead, you learn a new method, swallowing yawns. You practice it until it becomes second nature, a skill as precise and silent as threading a needle in candlelight. When you feel the tide rising, when your body begs for that long, delicious pull of air, you press your tongue flat, breathe in slowly through your nose, and swallow, as if the yawn is something edible, something you can digest and tuck away. It doesn't satisfy, it doesn't soothe, but it hides the evidence. And that, you now understand, is the point. Others notice your skill. Not the nobles, of course. They don't notice anything that doesn't offend them directly, but the other scribes, the younger ones brought in to learn under you. They whisper about your discipline, your stillness, the way your face never changes no matter how boring the dictation becomes. One of them, a girl with sharp eyes and ink-stained knuckles, asks you how you do it. You consider the question, then smile faintly and say, "You learn to breathe without asking your mouth's permission." She nods, unsure whether it's a joke. It's not entirely. The steward begins to trust you more. He has you copy personal letters, transcribe confessions, even listen in on quiet meetings where land is divided and marriage is arranged and punishments decided. You are no longer a child in the margins. You are a presence in the room, though no one addresses you. No one thanks you. No one speaks your name. You exist as a hand with a quill, a set of ears without a tongue, a pair of eyes that must never roll, liden, or close. And always, always, you are expected to be awake. You realize slowly that in this role, yawning is not just rudeness. It is treason. It is proof that your ears might be too human to retain secrets, that your mind might be too weak to handle power, that your body might still belong to the earth
and not the script. So, you tighten the boundaries around yourself. You drink bitter-root water in the mornings to keep your thoughts sharp. You avoid heavy meals. You sleep sitting up so your body never forgets the posture it must hold. You stop dreaming altogether, or if you do, the dreams are short and static and entirely without movement. You forget what it feels like to be tired and unafraid. And then, one day, in the middle of a particularly tedious discussion about drainage ditches and pig fences, the Lord himself yawns. He does it slowly, without apology, arms stretched above his head, mouth wide open, tongue curling upward like a cat's, and when he's done, he smacks his lips and says, "God, what a bore this all is!" And everyone laughs, including the steward, who repeats the line later to one of the cooks, as if it's something clever. You sit there, ink drying on your quill, and feel a kind of nausea rise in your chest. Because in that moment you see it all clearly. The yawning isn't forbidden. It's just forbidden to you. To them, it's a gesture of control, a sign that they are relaxed enough to show fatigue without consequence, powerful enough to reveal boredom without being questioned. For you, a yawn is a threat. For them, it's a luxury. You lower your eyes and keep writing. You swallow a breath. You press the quill harder than necessary until the nib scratches the parchment. You say nothing. You say everything by saying nothing. Because you know now that you are not just recording words. You are recording a world where silence is enforced from the bottom and yawned away from the top.
It is perhaps inevitable, given the sheer number of hours you now spend in rooms filled with droning voices and the thick scent of warmed ink, that something would eventually go wrong. Not catastrophically, not with shouts or chains or the cold touch of metal, but in the quietest, most dangerous way. The kind of wrongness that slips in through a crack in your routine and exposes just enough of your humanity to be noticed. And on this particular day, the room is especially warm, the windows drawn shut to keep out the wind, but the wind has vanished, and what's left is a stillness so dense it seems to hum, broken only by the scraping of chairs and the sluggish shuffle of the steward's boots across the stone floor as he reads aloud from yet another report about grain distribution and late taxes. And though your hand moves as it always does, steady, practiced, obedient, your mind begins to drift. Not far, not rebelliously, but just enough to loosen the threads that bind your attention to your discipline. You blink, you inhale, and your jaw, so well trained, so tightly held, relaxes. Just for a moment, just slightly, not wide, not audible, barely visible even, but it happens. You feel it instantly, the way a bird must feel the instant before the hawk strikes, that deep ancestral shiver that passes through your ribs and into your fingertips. And though you close your mouth before the breath can finish, though you even manage to keep your pen moving across the page, it's too late. The steward has turned. His eyes narrow. He does not speak. He does not need to. He simply stares for a second too long, the corner of his mouth lifting ever so slightly, not in amusement, but in recognition, as if to say, "I saw that, and so did everyone else." You lower your eyes. You keep writing. But the temperature in the room seems to drop, and though nothing more is said that day and no official note is made, you know the incident is now part of your story, part of how you will be remembered, not as a mistake, but as a mark. Later that week, the steward assigns you to assist a visiting clerk from a neighboring estate, a man with soft hands and a voice like wet wool. And though the task is simple, copying ledgers, re-inking titles, organizing inventory scrolls, the real assignment is obvious. You are being watched. Not openly, not cruelly, but tested, measured, observed under the guise of assistance. The clerk says little at first, then begins to make comments, gentle and subtle, about the importance of attentiveness, about how some households are particular about comportment, about how even a momentary lapse can signal deeper flaws. You nod, smile politely, repeat phrases of agreement. You do not yawn, not even once. You keep a mint leaf tucked in the corner of your cheek, sharp and bitter, a new addition to your repertoire of defenses.
And every time your mouth feels the impulse to stretch, you bite down, tasting the sting as a reminder of your place. The clerk seems satisfied. Eventually, he leaves. The steward does not mention the incident. But things change in small, unmistakable ways. You are no longer permitted to copy personal letters. Your seat is moved slightly farther from the hearth, just enough to chill your fingers by afternoon. You are asked to fetch water more often, to rise mid-session and serve as if to remind you that your value is conditional, dependent on performance, easily withdrawn. And you, understanding this with a clarity that comes only to those who have spent years under silent scrutiny, accept it without protest. Not because you believe it is fair, but because you know resistance must be invisible to survive.
In the weeks that follow, you become more cautious than ever. You stop dreaming again. You stop blinking too long. You stop thinking of the yawn as something that might return. It is now a ghost, banished, feared, remembered only as a warning. You teach yourself to sit straighter, to shift your weight in imperceptible ways that relieve pressure without drawing attention, to time your swallows with the rise and fall of the steward's breath. You become so still, so composed, that one of the younger scribes whispers to another, "He doesn't even sleep, I think, just waits with his eyes closed." You don't correct them. Let the myth grow. Let it shield you. But the truth is, you do sleep, sometimes too deeply, sometimes not at all, and it is in those nights of restless tossing that you begin to reflect, not on the fear, but on the absurdity of it all, on the fact that your entire life has been shaped by the shape of your mouth, by the expectation that you keep it closed, not just in speech, but in posture, in expression, in spirit. You begin to wonder what it would feel like to yawn openly, not in private, not in a stolen moment, but fully in the presence of those who believe themselves above such instincts. Would the world collapse? Would the steward faint? Would the parchment ignite from the heat of your defiance? Or would nothing happen at all, except that you, for the first time in decades, would feel your lungs filled to the edge, your spine stretch, your body breathe without shame? You know better, of course. You know that the punishment would not be immediate or theatrical. It would be slow, administrative, executed with smiles and quiet removals. You would lose assignments. You would be shifted to menial work. You would be spoken of in past tense while still alive. No one would say, "He yawned." They would say, "He grew unreliable," or "He was never quite the same after," or "We needed someone younger, more alert." So you do not test it. You keep the yawn sealed away, deep inside, not buried, but folded, like a letter unsent, waiting for a moment that may never come. And yet, despite everything, you do not resent the parsley, or the mint, or the tricks you've learned. You see them now not as shackles, but as tools, not as symbols of fear, but as quiet affirmations that you have outlasted the pressure. You have survived in stillness, not because you are weak, but because your endurance is a kind of strength they will never understand, because theirs has never been tested in the same way. They have yawned without consequence. You have yawned once and never forgotten it. And so, each day, you return to the scribe's bench, your pen steady, your mouth still, your breath quiet. And though your body aches and your thoughts wander and your soul yearns to stretch into something more, you remain present and unyielding, because you know that survival, in its quietest form, is still a kind of rebellion.
Time folds in on itself during the slower seasons, when the harvest has been stored and the roads turn to sludge, and the nobles retreat into their manors like sleepy cats, their windows glowing faintly through mist, while the rest of you return to routines shaped more by candlelight than clocks. And it is during one of these gray, muffled winters that your second brush with punishment arrives, not as a punishment for yourself, but as a judgment in which you must participate, summoned not to bear witness, but to write it down, to record the words exactly as spoken, and in doing so become complicit in a ritual you thought you could observe from the edges forever.
The offense is trivial, almost laughable in its scale. A yawn caught during a boundary dispute, of all things, in the third hour of deliberation, when the room had grown stifling and the arguments were chasing their own tails, and the boy, no more than 16, a stable hand from the southern lot, simply failed to mask his fatigue during a pause in the steward's questioning, a pause that dragged too long, heavy with silence, and into that silence came the quiet, half-formed opening of a mouth. You hadn't noticed it at first, too focused on your own page, the way the ink pooled slightly around the barbed hooks and the letter G, your quill's tip dulled from overuse. But the room changed. Instantly, the temperature dropped. The stillness turned brittle, and when you looked up, you saw the steward's eyes locked on the boy. Not with fury, but with something far more dangerous: calculation. The rest of the day passed as if nothing had happened. The dispute ended in a vague compromise. The noble involved said little. But afterward, as the fire dimmed and the scrolls were packed away, you were instructed to remain. The steward handed you a smaller ledger, one used for minor transgressions, and said simply, "Write it down." You hesitated, for a fraction of a second, not enough to be defiant, just enough for the steward to tilt his head and say, "We cannot have laxity creeping in, can we?" And so you wrote, recording the moment as if it were a fact of the weather, detailing the time, the witnesses, the subject's full name, the expression observed, the implied disrespect, all in the precise language that has been used for decades to frame the mundane as misconduct. The punishment, you noted, was to be symbolic, corrective rather than punitive, which meant the boy would be made to stand beside the chapel door each morning for a week, arms crossed, eyes downcast, with a ribbon tied around his face. Not tight, not painful, but obvious, a strip of cloth across the lower half of his head like a quiet echo of the iron masks no longer used but never quite forgotten. You handed the ledger back. The steward did not smile. He simply nodded, and you were dismissed. That night, you could not sleep. Not from guilt, exactly. You had not created the rule, and the punishment was not cruel, but from the feeling that something had shifted. You had crossed a threshold, moved from being shaped by the system to becoming a hand that shapes it, even if just by writing the words. You dreamed not of the boy, but of yourself, standing in his place, the ribbon wet with fog, your breath caught beneath the cloth, eyes cast downward as others passed without looking. You awoke with your jaw clenched so tightly that your tongue throbbed.
The next day, you watched from the corner of the chapel yard as the boy stood in silence, as instructed. No one mocked him. No one even acknowledged him. That was the punishment. Not the ribbon, but the absence of reaction. The way his presence had been hollowed out, turned into a warning that required no commentary. The other stable hands passed him with practiced indifference. A few village children stared for a moment, then were hurried along by their mothers. The priest nodded at him once, solemnly, as if to say, "You've entered the liturgy now." And you, scribe and silent enforcer, felt something settle heavily in your stomach. Not shame, but understanding. This is how the system sustains itself. Not through cruelty, but through participation. You began to see the cycle everywhere. A child yawns. A parent hushes them, not harshly, but with gentle fear. A worker shifts their weight during a sermon and is given extra chores. A servant appears weary and is moved to the edge of the hall. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth rebellion. Just small corrections, like pebbles placed in shoes. Not enough to cripple, but enough to change how you walk. And so, you walked differently. You became even more composed. You spoke less. You breathed more quietly. You kept a tally in your mind of every time you caught yourself nearly slipping. 7 times in a week, then 5, then 3. Eventually, you stopped counting. It wasn't that the temptation faded, but that the reflex to suppress had become automatic, like blinking, or breathing, or blinking while breathing. Once, during a particularly dull meeting about stone allotments,
You glanced across the table and saw one of the older clerks, usually a model of restraint, press his thumb to the side of his jaw, subtly massaging a muscle gone tight from too much stillness. The gesture was so small, so human, that for a moment you felt a surge of sympathy so strong it made your throat ache. But then the steward cleared his throat, and the clerk's hand dropped. You both returned to stillness. It occurred to you then that there might be no end to it, that this discipline you had internalized would not earn you freedom, but only more responsibility, more expectation, more eyes waiting to see if you would break the very rules you were praised for embodying. And yet, you found a strange comfort in that, not because you enjoyed it, but because it gave shape to your days. The structure became a kind of shelter, thin and hard and unwelcoming, but reliable. You knew who you were because you knew what you must not do. Still, the memory of that small yawn, the almost imperceptible shift in the boy's mouth, stayed with you. You found yourself recreating it in private, in the dark, lying flat on your back, eyes on the ceiling, lips parting just slightly, not enough to stretch the jaw, but enough to feel air move differently. It was not satisfying, it did not refresh, but it reminded you that the instinct was still there, buried but not dead. And that, for now, was enough.
The weeks pass, folding into months as the seasons shift with their usual quiet stubbornness. Wet paths giving way to dry dust, frost turning back into morning dew. And you find yourself more and more a fixture of the manor's internal rhythm, a reliable presence who knows when to arrive, when to stand, when to nod, when to vanish. And it is this reliability that eventually leads to your inclusion in a proceeding that feels different from the others, not because of its importance, property disputes as always, but because of the tension in the air, the silence before things begin, the subtle glances between the lords that suggest something unsaid, something unrecorded. You are summoned to scribe for a gathering involving two neighboring estates, each represented by a lord of equal standing, neither particularly noble in behavior, but both wrapped in the usual performances of velvet, lineage, and the heavy perfume of board authority. The dispute is over a patch of land so small and dry it can barely support weeds, but still, it is fought over as if it contains gold. You sit at your station, quill ready, face unreadable, mouth sealed, while the arguments begin in the polite tones of men trained in debate but worn down by years of ritualized posturing. The words rise and fall in measured waves, a sound not unlike distant waves hitting an indifferent shore, and after a time, perhaps an hour, perhaps more, you feel the familiar weight in your jaw, the slow tug of weariness that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with repetition, with the endless sameness of voices echoing just above your head. You press your tongue flat, you inhale through your nose, you focus on the movement of the quill, and just as you feel yourself settling into that space of disciplined stillness, it happens. Not from you, not from the scribes, not from a child seated near the wall, but from one of the lords himself, the younger of the two, dressed in green, his boots far too polished for a man who claims to inspect fields, and without warning, without shame, he lets out a yawn. A long one. A loud one. He stretches his arms overhead, mouth open so wide it looks like his jaw might unhinge, and for a moment the room pauses, not in horror, but in anticipation, as if waiting to see how this will be received. And then, impossibly, absurdly, the other lord laughs. "Tiring yourself with your own arguments, are you?" he says, and everyone chuckles. The steward joins in. Even the priest smiles. The yawn is forgiven, forgotten, erased. You do not move. You do not smile. You lower your eyes to the page and record none of it. Not the yawn, not the laughter, not the break in protocol. You simply continue writing, noting only the next legal phrase, the next claim of ownership, because that is what is expected, and because you know with perfect clarity that if you had yawned in that moment, if anyone else in the room had done what that nobleman did, it would not have become a joke. It would have become a lesson, a correction, a mark.
The absurdity of it washes over you in a cold wave, the sheer imbalance, the cruelty wrapped in ceremony. You chew a sliver of mint from your pocket, not for wakefulness, but to steady the twist in your gut. Later, as you prepare the clean transcript for the steward's record, he stops beside your table, glances at the page, and says, "You left out the moment of levity." He means the yawn. You look up, expression blank, and say, "It did not seem relevant to the dispute." The steward watches you for a long moment, then nods. "Quite right. No need to document everything. Some things are better left to memory." He walks away. You exhale slowly. You write the final word.
That night, you do not sleep. Not because you are troubled, not because of guilt or fear, but because your mind keeps circling the same question. What is memory for, if not to keep record of the things we are not allowed to say aloud? You lie awake, replaying the yawn again and again, the way the Lord's mouth stretched without consequence, the way the laughter filled the room, the way everyone accepted that one person's fatigue could be framed as charm, while another's was framed as rebellion. And in the stillness of your small chamber, you feel something shift. Not a rebellion, not yet, but a gathering awareness, a seed of something quiet and hard, like the first stone in a wall that will one day block out the old fear. The next day, a servant is scolded for yawning during the morning firewood tally, not punished formally, just scolded, a reminder, spoken too loudly, designed to carry. You watch it happen from the hallway, the words sharp, the servant's head bowed, the others glancing away. And something in you hardens, because now you have seen both sides, and now you cannot unsee them. You begin to collect these moments, silently, methodically, not in your official ledger, but in a small stitched book hidden behind the lining of your satchel. You record the date, the name, the place, the nature of the yawn or the sigh or the pause too long, and what followed. You do not write judgments, only observations. The book fills slowly, one entry at a time, a quiet archive of the invisible boundaries that define your world. The book is not meant to be read, it is meant to exist. That is enough. Over time, others begin to confide in you. A younger boy in the scribe's wing tells you about the time he nearly fainted trying to stifle a yawn during the bishop's sermon. A laundress says she sometimes yawns underwater while rinsing linens just to feel free. An old cook says he once yawned openly in front of a visiting baron and blamed it on smoke from the hearth. They smile as they tell you. Small, exhausted smiles. Not joyful, just real. You nod, and you say nothing. You tuck their stories away like coins in a hidden jar, unsure of what they're for, only that they must not be lost. Because you now understand that the history written in ink is only half of the truth. The other half is told in gestures suppressed, breath withheld, and faces stilled by the quiet terror of being seen at the wrong time. And so you carry on, your mouth closed, your posture straight, your records precise. But inside, there is motion. Inside, something has begun to stir.
Your reputation continues to grow, not loudly, not in proclamations or public praise, but in the soft-spoken currency of trust, of quiet nods from stewards and squires, of being chosen for tasks that require not just accuracy, but composure. And so it happens, almost without your consent, that you become the one called upon to train the younger ones, the new scribes, the quiet-footed boys and girls who arrived clutching their bundles of quills and linen-wrapped inkpots, eyes darting to every corner of the Matter Hall as if expecting the walls to speak. They look to you as if you hold secrets, and in a way, you do. Not just the contents of the ledgers and scrolls, but the deeper knowledge of how to move through this world without leaving footprints, how to breathe without sound,
how to remain perfectly still even when your whole body hums with restlessness. You don't begin with the ink. You begin with the mouth. You teach them, not harshly, but with that same tired patience that was once offered to you, that the work of a scribe is not only with the hand, but with the face, that the mouth is to be neutral, neither smiling nor frowning, neither speaking nor yawning, a mouth trained to vanish while the hand records everything else. You show them the parsley trick. You demonstrate how to adjust posture to keep the spine awake without inviting scrutiny. You let them practice in silence, dictating a long, dull list of poultry counts while watching their shoulders slump and their jaws tremble. And when they yawn, you do not scold them. You simply stop speaking, wait for their faces to burn red, and then begin again. They learn, slowly, reluctantly. They murmur to one another about your discipline, about how you never seem to falter. And one day, one of the younger boys asks you, whispering as though fearful the air itself might tattle, "Have you ever been punished?" You pause, quill in hand, and for a moment you consider telling him the truth, that yes, once, long ago, in a room where breath was thick and the steward's eyes too quick. But instead you say, "I learned before they had to teach me." And the boy nods, impressed, not realizing that learning is its own punishment when the lesson is silence. And as you train them, as they come and go like drifting clouds, some lasting weeks, others only days, you begin to see your own reflection in them, not in their features or their movements, but in the struggle they wear beneath their stillness, that fight between the instinct to stretch, to breathe, to exist fully, and the learned fear that any of those things might be read as insubordination. You begin to understand that you are not just passing on a skill. You are passing on a kind of inheritance, one not written in blood or wealth, but in the language of suppression. They will go on to serve new lords, to copy new names, but they will carry your lessons with them, the discipline of the jaw, the scripture of silence. And perhaps they too will become instructors one day, bearing the weight of a tradition no one ever chose, but everyone continues.
One evening, after the halls have emptied and the last quills have been rinsed, you sit alone at your table and open the hidden book, the one with no title, the one you fill not with legal record, but with truth. And you turn to a blank page and write, "Taught 3 today." One lasted the full hour without a yawn. The others bit their cheeks. I told them to keep parsley in their sleeves. And then, without thinking, you add another line, one you hadn't written before. They shouldn't have to learn this. The ink glistens for a moment before soaking in, and you stare at the words, not with guilt, but with something slower, heavier, a kind of sadness that has no edge, no name. The next day, during a noble's wedding announcement, an affair so drenched in tedium and formal language it could put stone to sleep, you see one of your trainees falter, a girl with clever fingers and a face that always looks like it's just heard something funny, and her mouth opens, not wide, not dramatic, but just enough, and she catches it too late. The steward sees, the noble sees, you see. The moment freezes. Then she bows her head, murmurs an apology, and the noble, perhaps in a generous mood or perhaps too distracted by his own voice, waves it off with a chuckle. "Let the poor thing breathe," he says, and everyone laughs. The moment passes, but she looks at you later, eyes wide, as if to ask whether that really just happened. You nod once, but you say nothing, because you both know it could have gone another way. And the only reason it didn't is because of mood, timing, status, things no one can control. You begin to notice, more and more, how arbitrary it all is. One boy is reprimanded for a cough, another is ignored despite nearly dozing off. A visiting scribe yawns loudly in the steward's presence and is offered wine. The lines are not fixed, they are drawn by whim. And yet the fear remains constant.
evenly distributed across those with no power to predict where the line will fall next. You wonder if the nobles ever notice how still the room becomes when they enter, how every face smooths, every spine stiffens, every mouth presses shut as if sealed by invisible hands. You wonder if they understand that their presence is not inspiring obedience, but inducing paralysis. Or perhaps they do understand. Perhaps that's the point. One afternoon, while sorting a bundle of misfiled marriage records, you find a note tucked between the pages, written in a hand that is not yours and not anyone you know. It reads, "I yawned 3 times today and lived. Tell no one." You stare at it, laugh, softly, silently, and then fold it, press it between the pages of your hidden book, and write beneath it, "Resistance in jest is still resistance." You go on teaching. You go on writing. You go on not yawning. But somewhere in the quiet moments between ink and breath, you begin to imagine what it might feel like to do so again, fully, deeply, in a room that does not measure worth by how tightly a mouth can remain closed.
There is a moment, deep into the season of long evenings and early twilight, when your stillness becomes legend, not in the way of heroes or saints, but in the murmured reverence reserved for those who are thought to have mastered something the rest cannot bear to name. And without your asking or permission, you begin to find yourself at the center of a strange kind of admiration, the kind that arises when someone has suffered visibly, survived invisibly, and remained in place long enough to become a symbol of a lesson others are too weary to teach. You hear it first from a boy passing behind the manor kitchens, telling another, "Don't let your mouth go loose, not unless you want to end up like him." And though the words are neither cruel nor kind, they carry weight, the way all half-truths do. And you realize, as your hands fold around the parchment once again, that you have become not merely a model, but a myth, a caution in flesh and bone. And this, strangely, gives you a certain kind of power. The young ones begin to seek your advice not only on script and form, but on comportment, on how to endure the endless hours of nothing, the dull ache in the back of the eyes, the invisible pressure that wraps itself around the chest like a sleeping cat. They ask you what to do when the head dips, when the air thickens, when the steward's voice turns into syrup and the ink dances on the page. And you teach them, not through instruction, but through ritual. You demonstrate the mint-and-cheek method, the 3-tap finger trick against the knee, the shifting of weight across the arches of the foot to create a rhythm the body can follow when the mind cannot. You tell them to memorize the number of windows in the chamber, to count backwards from 30 by 3s, to inhale slowly and imagine threading a needle with each breath. You give them these tools without pride, not because they elevate you, but because you remember what it was like to need them and have no one to ask. As word spreads of your steadiness, even those beyond the manor take notice. You are asked to speak, to advise a group of newly appointed readers and message runners at the small chapel annex in the neighboring village. It is not a formal ceremony, merely a quiet gathering of pale faces and eager pens, but when you stand before them, you see in their eyes the familiar hunger for answers, the fear of doing it wrong, the question no one speaks aloud. How do I make myself disappear while still being useful? You tell them, gently, that the body must be trained like a flame in a windless room, not too bright, not too dim, just steady. And they nod, as though you have given them the key to something sacred. It is during one of these small sessions that you find yourself speaking not from habit, but from something closer to memory, closer to grief. You say, there are days when the yawn doesn't come, and you think you've beaten it. But that's not winning. That's forgetting what your body used to ask for. You see one of the girls pause, a quill hovering mid-air. You do not explain further. You don't need to. The ones who understand already feel it. Your name begins to float, quietly, in corners of rooms you've never entered. You are referenced, cited, imitated. You overhear someone say, he's never made a sound unless summoned. And another respond, they say he doesn't even breathe like the rest of us. You want to laugh, but you don't. Not because it isn't funny, but because it's easier to let the silence remain undisturbed.
Eventually, you are asked to train the steward's nephew, a boy no older than 12, sent from some estate plagued with mischief, a boy with sharp eyes and a mouth that is never closed for more than 3 seconds at a time. The first day he yawns, spectacularly, rudely, twice. You say nothing. The steward glares. The boy rolls his eyes. On the second day, he lasts a full hour without incident. On the third, he folds his hands. On the fourth, he blinks at you and says, "It's not hard to keep quiet, it's just boring." You consider this. Then you respond, "Boredom is a gift when punishment is the alternative." He doesn't understand, not yet, but he will. By the end of the month, the boy has changed. He walks straighter. He fidgets less. He has learned not only how to avoid being noticed, but how to make others believe that it was his idea to begin with. He still yawns now and then, when alone, behind doors, but you hear it less and less, as if his body has started to forget that it ever needed to. One evening, long after the halls have emptied and your own eyes feel heavy with the weight of a day too full of repetition, the boy returns to your side and asks, "When do I get to teach someone?" You smile, faintly, not from amusement, but from recognition. You hand him your oldest quill, worn nearly to a nub. "When you learn to tell the difference between hiding and surviving," you say. He furrows his brow. "What's the difference?" You don't answer. He'll find out soon enough. Alone again, you unroll your hidden book and add a new entry. He yawns only in solitude now, still human, not broken, not yet. And beside that, in smaller script, "I hope he teaches someone better than I did." Because the longer you serve as instructor, the more you realize that your legacy is not in the precision of your script or the stillness of your hands, but in the rituals you pass down, the ones that teach others how to endure what should never have needed enduring in the first place. You begin to wonder if teaching them how to hide is kindness or cruelty, whether giving them parsley and tricks is protection or capitulation, whether by helping them navigate the system you have also helped preserve it. You do not answer those questions. You write them down. The days lengthen again. The frost fades. The steward grows grayer. The new scribes get younger. You keep teaching. You keep not yawning. But sometimes, in the soft hour just before sleep, you lie on your cot with the window open, the cold air drifting in like a whispered thought, and you part your lips only slightly and let the breath stretch long through your teeth and into your lungs. You do not yawn, but you remember how it used to feel.
There was a feast one spring, not a grand one by noble standards, just a regional gathering of minor lords and landholders to celebrate the season's first good yields. And though it requires the usual flood of preparations, boar roasted whole, banners hung, floors scrubbed until they shine like wet stone, the event itself is not remarkable except for what you witness from your place at the back of the hall, seated just behind the last row of retainers, quill and parchment balanced on your knee, there not to dine or serve, but to transcribe the toasts, the introductions, the flow of honors exchanged like coins tossed into a fountain where no one expects wishes to come true. You sit where you always sit, face still, eyes tracking words like birds through tall brass, and it is during the third toast, given by a lord with more beard than voice, that you catch the flicker of something so unexpected, so absurd, that for a moment your hand stops moving, your breath stills, and you are no longer writing, you are watching. A noble, high-ranking, dressed in pale blue and silver, sitting near the dais beside two others of similar rank, leans back in his chair, covers his mouth delicately with 2 fingers, and yawns. Not once, twice, 3 times, each more pronounced than the last, his eyes watery,
his chin lifted, his mouth open in such theatrical slow motion that it might have been a gesture of mockery rather than fatigue, and yet no one reacts. Not the steward, not the scribes beside you, not the servants rushing trays of wine past silk-draped chairs. No one so much as shifts in response, as if the man had simply adjusted his cuff or reached for a grape. And this time, you do not record a single word of the toast. You sit motionless, the ink drying at the tip of your quill, heart thudding not with envy or outrage, but with a strange, hollow understanding that fills you like cold water. Because now, you finally see it fully, without the fog of youth or the hope of justice, that yawning is not forbidden, that yawning was never forbidden, that what has always been punished is your yawning, your breath, your exhaustion, because for them, a yawn is a punctuation mark, a flourish, a moment of indulgent humanity wrapped in velvet. For you, it is a rupture in the script you've been ordered to perform every day of your life. Their yawns are private performances made public without consequence. Yours would be read aloud as confession. You wonder then how many other gestures have been permitted only to the powerful while forbidden to the tired. You wonder if they ever think of it, how they slouch, stretch, scratch, sigh, without fear, without shame. And it dawns on you that perhaps the reason the nobles never truly enforced the yawning laws upon their own is not hypocrisy, but theater, because they do not need to be ruled by rules when they are the stage on which the rules are performed. Later that evening, after the final toast and the slow unfurling of laughter and wine-stained smiles, you pass the steward in the corridor, and he says, "A fine gathering," and you nod, because it is what you must do, and he adds, with a smirk just sharp enough to be deliberate, "No incidents of disrespect. Our scribes have learned well." You say nothing. You keep walking. Your feet make no sound on the stone.
But that night, you do not sleep. You sit in your room by the small candle stub that flickers like a nervous heartbeat, and you open your hidden book, your book of unwritten truths, and instead of adding a new entry, you flip back through old ones. Edric's punishment, Noel's humiliation, the girl with the ribbon, the boy who asked when he could teach. And you begin to draw a line, one long diagonal that cuts through every page, a silent thread connecting all the places where control was mistaken for grace, where survival was mistaken for virtue. You do not cry. You do not curse. You simply read what you have written, as if it belongs to someone else, someone younger, someone who once believed that stillness could be a shield instead of a sentence. And then, in the morning, you rise. You wash your face, you eat your bread, you carry your quill, and you go back. Because what else can you do? You teach, you train, you speak in low tones about discipline, about breath control, about the invisible architecture of composure. But when they ask why, when they ask who wrote these rules, you begin, subtly, gently, to shift the shape of your answers. You no longer say, because they will punish you. You say, because the world will pretend not to see you until you slip. And they nod, and they practice harder. But one day, just once, you break form. It happens during a private lesson with one of the younger scribes, a boy whose hands shake when he writes, but whose eyes never miss a word. He yawns, not loud, not exaggerated, but fully, honestly, helplessly. And then he freezes, panic blooming across his face. You watch him. The room is quiet. And then, without speaking, you allow your own mouth to open, just slightly, slowly, as though testing a muscle you haven't used in years. It's not a proper yawn. It's not even close. But it's enough. The boy watches you, confused. You say, "It's all right." And in that moment, it is.
By the time your hair begins to gray, not in patches, not all at once, but strand by quiet strand, like dust settling on the rafters of a room no longer swept, you have outlasted most of those who once enforced the rules you have spent your life internalizing. And though the steward still walks with purpose and sharp shoes, his voice carries less weight than it once did, and many of the nobles you once copied breathlessly have faded from the record, their lands absorbed, their names softened by disuse. And yet, you remain. Not because you were chosen, not because you sought to stay, but because stillness, once practiced long enough, becomes indistinguishable from permanence. They say now that you are part of the manor, part of its bones, that the quills move when you enter, that scrolls seem to unfurl on their own in your presence. You do not correct them. You smile, faintly, a wrinkle near your eye folding gently, and you continue to serve, because there is something in the rhythm of it all, the scratching of the pen, the careful unrolling of parchment, the muscle memory of dates and names that keeps your breath steady even when your thoughts are anything but. What has changed, though, what continues to change, quietly and without announcement, is the generation around you. The young scribes no longer tremble as you once did. They enter the hall with practiced dignity, but not fear. They laugh in the courtyard. They stretch their arms when they think no one is looking. Some even yawn, discreetly, behind books or hands or sleeves, but they do it, and what is more remarkable is that sometimes no one stops them. No one punishes. No ribbons, no kneeling, no ledger entries written in red. And you begin to see something that startles you, not in its presence, but in its subtlety. The rules are softening, not loudly, not all at once, but like rope loosening from a stake as the wind changes direction. You are not sure when it began. Perhaps it was the steward's illness last winter, when his voice thinned and the punishment stopped for a few weeks, and people realized the world did not collapse. Perhaps it was the younger nobles, those educated in cities, returned with different eyes, less eager to be adored, more bored by ceremony. Or perhaps it is simply time, the slow, grinding erosion of absurdity when held too long against the quiet pressure of reason. Regardless of the cause, you see it happening, and part of you feels relief. The other part, the deeper, older part, feels something you cannot name. Not jealousy, not regret, but a kind of ache, as though watching someone else leave a prison through a door you never noticed was there. One morning, during a training session in the scriptorium, a girl in a green tunic lets out a yawn so wide and honest that half the room freezes. Her eyes flutter. She covers her mouth too late. You wait for someone to speak. No one does. The moment passes. She catches your eye and shrinks a little, as if bracing for judgment. But you say nothing. You nod once and continue the lesson. And just like that, something small and invisible shifts again. Later, in your quiet chamber, you write in your hidden book, "The air today, a loud breath."
The days grow longer. The punishment lists, once nailed like commandments to the chapel wall, are now kept in a drawer, seldom referenced. They are not burned, they are not renounced. They simply fade, like ink on old parchment, their authority smudged by years of neglect. When the steward's nephew, now a man, now the steward himself in all but title, asks your opinion on discipline, you say, "Let them sit comfortably. They write better that way." He hesitates, then agrees. And when a young scribe asks whether yawning is still forbidden, you respond with a question of your own. Do you think it should be? The boy shrugs, thoughtful, and says, "Only if it's meant to be rude." And you find that you have no argument left. There is something new in your routine now, not rebellion, not defiance, but curiosity. You begin to keep a second book, one not hidden, one with a proper cover, and in it you begin to write observations, not of infractions, but of moments when people allowed themselves to be human without consequence. A servant smiling too long in a mirror,
a priest rubbing his temples mid-sermon, a scribe humming softly while sorting parchments. You title it, quietly, The Book of Permission. No one knows of it yet. You don't share it, but you keep it on the shelf beside your inkpots, not locked away, not disguised. And one day, in the late light of afternoon, you walk through the manor hall and hear laughter, a burst of it, sharp and unrehearsed. And when you peer into the room, you see 3 junior scribes collapsed in a pile of scrolls, giggling over something clumsy and ridiculous in the records. One is yawning through his nose, another waves a hand in mock horror. You expect the steward's voice to ring out. It doesn't. You expect someone to hush them. No one does. You stand there, unnoticed for a full minute, watching. And when you walk away, you feel no bitterness, only warmth. A strange warmth, quiet and full. That evening, in the hidden book, you write, "I am no longer afraid they will forget the rules. I hope they do." You know now that change is not a moment. It is a season. It arrives slowly, draped in the language of accident. And only in retrospect do we recognize it for what it was. Not rebellion, not revolution, but permission. A yawn allowed, a silence unpunished, a breath released without fear. You have waited your whole life to see it, and now, at last, it is here.
The older you grow, the quieter the days become. Not because there is less to do. There is always something to transcribe, something to correct, something to clarify, but because you move through it all with such practiced ease that even time seems to step aside for you, letting the hours pass like shadows slipping across stone, and what once felt like a constant state of performance now feels, oddly, like breathing, though not the deep, uninhibited kind, not the breath of freedom, but the soft, shallow rhythm of someone who has learned to live in narrow spaces without complaint. You rise before the bell rings. You prepare your ink before the steward thinks to ask. You sharpen the quills so cleanly that others now request yours instead of the spares. You are no longer reminded to be still, to be silent, to be diligent. Your presence has come to define those things, and so no one bothers to watch you anymore. You are, at last, invisible, not by fear, but by legend, and there is a certain peace in that. And yet, beneath that still surface, something has begun to move. It is not rebellion, it is not anger, it is not even hope. It is simply a noticing, a gentle but relentless awareness of what has changed around you, what has softened, what has loosened its grip. The steward now consults you, not commands you. The new scribes forget their posture when excited and are not corrected. The priest has stopped preaching about the devil entering through yawns, and in his place, a younger friar speaks more of mercy than order. Even the punishment list, the one you once transcribed in triplicate, has not been updated in over a year, its parchment curled at the edges, its ink fading to a kind of irrelevance. And most telling of all, no one speaks of yawns anymore, not to praise their suppression, not to warn against their presence. They have simply vanished from the list of threats. But you have not forgotten. You cannot forget. And so you begin to write, not in secret, not in code, but in full, plain script, your hands steady and deliberate, as if recording weather or grain yield. You begin to write the full account, from beginning to now, not as confession, not as complaint, but as record, because you understand something no one else seems to notice, that when a fear fades, when a rule loses its teeth, history begins to lie by omission. You write about Edric, about Null, about the ribbon across the mouth of the girl who dared to open hers during a prayer, about the days when parsley was currency, about the whispered prayers to saints of stillness, about the days when you feared your own breath
more than you feared hunger. The young scribes ask what you're writing. You tell them it's a manual. They laugh and ask if it's about how not to fall asleep during tax readings. You smile and say yes, and they nod and run off to chase each other around the outer yard, their voices rising like birds. You don't stop them. You don't remind them to behave. You sit and write. And then one day, you stop. Not out of fatigue, not from pain, but because you are no longer needed in the same way. The steward's nephew, now steward in name and function, thanks you quietly and says that the new clerks will carry on the work. You nod. He doesn't offer ceremony.
He doesn't make a speech. He simply places a hand on your shoulder and says, "You've given them more than rules. You gave them calm." And you feel for the first time that perhaps your stillness was not just a survival mechanism. Perhaps it was also a kind of gift, however accidental. You begin spending your mornings walking the outer grounds, where the trees bend gently in the wind, and no one expects you to keep time. The new scribes still wave at you, sometimes running to show you their scrolls or ask about grammar. You answer them all, not with the voice of a master, but with the ease of someone who knows the weight of silence and how to use it wisely. Sometimes you pass the chapel and see someone yawn, openly, without shame, and you catch yourself holding your breath, the old reflex rising like a memory, but then you exhale, slowly, letting it go. In the evenings, you sit with your two books, the hidden one, now nearly full, and the second, the open one, the one you've begun sharing with those who ask. You read entries aloud, not often, but sometimes, and you tell the younger ones how the world used to punish things that could not be helped, and how people learned to help each other in quiet ways when the rules refused to change. One boy listens carefully, then asks, "Why didn't anyone just stop the rules sooner?" And you pause, and you say, "Because we were taught that the rule was more important than the reason." He thinks about that, then asks, "Is it still true?" And you answer, "Not anymore." You still don't yawn in public. Not because you're afraid, but because the habit is older than your bones. Still, one night, in your small room, by the open window, as the stars gather like dust on the black cloth of the sky, you let your mouth fall open, slowly, and take in the longest breath you can manage, your jaw stretching wide, your chest rising, your eyes watering just slightly as the yawn crests and releases. And when it's done, you smile. Not because it was satisfying, but because this time, you didn't have to swallow it.
The seasons continue to turn, as they always do, slow and soft and full of the same familiar creaks and sighs. And you, now older than most remember being possible, find yourself watching more than doing, listening more than speaking, and in this late chapter of your life, you become something closer to a monument than a man, a living archive of rules once feared, of silences once sacred, and the village treats you with a quiet reverence born not from titles or blood, but from the simple fact that you have outlasted the old world without losing yourself entirely to it. You no longer write official records. Others do that now. You no longer train scribes or attend manor meetings. Those have become rituals for younger voices. Instead, you walk, you sit, you remember. Sometimes you rest beneath the eaves of the chapel where you once feared to breathe too loudly, and watch the children chase each other around the worn path where the punishment post once stood, long since pulled down, the ground now worn smooth with play instead of penance. People still come to you, not for correction, but for context, asking what things meant, why they were done, how it came to be that a yawn was once considered dangerous. You do your best to explain, but often you simply tell them the stories, the boy who wore the ribbon, the steward who looked like he was carved from chalk, the woman who whispered that fennel was safer than mint. You don't dramatize it. You don't make villains. You don't excuse it either. You just tell it like you remember it, slowly, gently, like turning over stones in a garden. And always, when they ask what changed, you say, enough people stopped pretending they weren't tired. And that seems to satisfy them. You've begun to pass your 2 books into other hands. The hidden book, the one filled with names and punishments and rituals of silence, you give to a young scribe named Mara, who copies it in neat, curling script, not for use, but for history. The second book, the Book of Permission, you keep near the well, bound now in leather, with space at the back for new entries. Anyone may write in it. Anyone may read it. It fills slowly, tenderly, with notes about gestures allowed, mistakes forgiven, moments when someone breathed and was not punished. The pages smell of ink and sunlight. One entry reads, "I yawned during the wedding speech. My brother squeezed my hand and smiled." Another says, "The steward's baby yawned during Mass. He laughed and called it a blessing." You read them sometimes, not because you need to remember, but because it helps you believe.
You've stopped counting the years. The days are enough. You wake, you eat, you watch the wind move through the trees. Some mornings you yawn before the sun rises, and you let it stretch through your shoulders and into your fingertips like a quiet hymn. No one watches, no one corrects. Some evenings, the priest, now old himself, joins you by the well, and you sit without talking, just listening to the frogs and the rustling grass. And when he finally speaks, he says, "I used to preach against yawning. Can you imagine?" And you smile and say, "I remember." And he laughs and replies, "God must have been so bored." And then one day, you don't wake. Not suddenly, not with pain, just quietly. Your hands folded beneath your chin, your mouth gently closed, the breath having left you not with a gasp, but with a long, satisfied sigh. They bury you near the chapel, beneath a tree that flowers only in late spring, and they place no stone, at your request, only a bench nearby with your 2 books tucked beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth. Children sit there now. They write stories. They drop pictures. One writes, "I yawned today and no one minded. Thank you." And so the story ends, not with silence, not with stillness, but with breath released freely, with mouths open not in rebellion, but in comfort, in presence, in rest.
And now, as the candlelight dims and the last page has settled into quiet, let your own breath move gently, as if each inhale carries the weight of forgotten rules, and each exhale releases them, one by one, like petals drifting from an old tree. Picture yourself there, in that little village, under the soft blue dusk, where no one rushes anymore, where even the air seems to hum with a lullaby too slow to finish. You are sitting beneath the tree, the one that flowers only in spring, a book in your lap and the fading scent of ink still clinging to your fingertips. Around you the breeze is calm, the sky full of low stars, and in the distance someone is laughing, not loudly, but warmly, the kind of laugh that asks for nothing in return. And as you sit, your jaw loosens, your shoulders fall, and the weight you didn't even know you were holding begins to dissolve into the earth beneath you. You yawn, not because you are disobedient, not because you are bored, but because you are safe, and no one will write your name down because of it. You let your mouth open wide and slow, your eyes close, your breath deepen, and nothing bad happens. In fact, the only thing that follows is stillness and peace and the sense that the world has tilted ever so slightly in your favor, just enough to let you sleep. So now, if you feel the pull, let your own breath stretch, let your face soften, and allow your thoughts to drift wherever they like. There are no rules here, no punishments, no need to hide, only quiet, only warmth, only rest.